You found the skeleton. How would you calculate that? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're taking a look at a Creation Today show. Creation Today is the ministry of Eric Hovind, the younger and estranged son of Kent Hovind. His guest is John Sanford, a former plant geneticist turned dishonest pseudoscientific hack. This video is going to go into mostly things about human genetics and how, according to John Sanford, that supports the literal existence of Adam and Eve some 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Without further ado, here's Eric.
It was in 1869 that DNA was discovered by Swiss researcher Friedrich Miescher.
I want to point out that at that time, no one knew what DNA did, and they certainly didn't know it was a double helix. Eric's on-screen image seemed to imply otherwise.
Since then, the more we learn about it, the more fascinated we are by it.
Yeah, DNA is pretty darn cool, as is genetics.
So my question for us today, can DNA, can genetics, can the information that is inside each and every one of us provide evidence or even potentially a timeline that demonstrates the truth of the biblical worldview?
First, there is no such thing as the biblical worldview. There are biblical worldviews, but none of them have a special claim to being the special one biblical worldview, and this is because the Bible is a contradictory text with no one view of God, sin, or salvation. Any worldview constructed from it will have to prioritize some views within the Bible while contradicting others, which are then usually hand-waved or reinterpreted. Second, no biblical worldview can be supported by genetics unless it's a worldview that is willing to adapt to scientific findings, which Eric's is not.
Do our genetics start with Adam and Eve?
No, they do not. All attempts to demonstrate otherwise rely on ignoring data, misusing data, and usually dishonesty.
In order to answer that question, I'm going to need somebody a lot smarter than me to give me some help, okay?
That's a low bar.
Our guest today was a professor at Cornell University and is the inventor of the gene gun. He's the founder and former president of Logos Research Associates, and he has a fascinating story. And he's truly brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. John Sanford. Dr. Sanford, welcome to the Creation Today show.
Thank you very much.
I love your story because you were not always a believer in Christ. Can you give us a quick summary of your story?
I'll go out on a limb and predict that the story is that he converted to a branch of Christianity for reasons unrelated to any scientific evidence for a young Earth, or that evolution is impossible, and only after finding that that reality was theologically uncomfortable did he decide that reality was in fact negotiable, leading him to become a pseudoscientist.
A quick summary. I remember being a little child and looking up at the blue sky through the leaves of our tree and having a God moment. I remember several God moments when I was just a child.
Who cares? Someone connected his adult religion to experiences of awe in childhood. That's great for him, but it's probably not why he decided that science was wrong and bad, actually.
By the time I was in high school, I loved science, and I was being taught that science is antithetical to God.
I highly doubt that. What's more likely is that he is retroactively reinterpreting his science instruction that is at odds with his reality denial as being anti-God. In reality, I bet his teachers were probably themselves Christians, since statistically that's extremely likely, especially given Sanford's age.
And so I became an atheist in high school, and I was a rabid atheist in college.
Oh good, we get to see what a cringy edgelord Reddit atheist type is like when they become a creationist hack. My guess is that the edge was blunted, but that the cringe remained.
And along the way, a number of people touched me in a way that
Made him feel funny in his special place?
made me rethink. And the most important one was my wife.
And that was supposed to be a joke, but I'm guessing in her case it was more literal.
And so neither one of us were saved when we got married, but we really loved each other. But that started to break down about 10 years into our marriage. And my wife had common sense to go to church for the first time. She had never been in a church her whole life. And
Okay, so Sanford was in a family marriage, which put his wife into emotional turmoil, and she sought out comfort in a church. All pretty understandable. Also, nothing to do with, scientific evidence.
anyway, I started to tag along with her, just kind of out of curiosity. We both fell in love with Jesus. It was really very beautiful road that we traveled on.
Well, now that Sanford is a throuple with his wife and Jesus, I suspect we're close to the reality denial part.
And things were working much better. But I hadn't been saved yet. So I was baptized when I was 39, and we were baptized together.
Man, evangelical soteriology is both so simple and also weirdly arcane. Like it involves belief in Christianity, but also there needs to be some kind of singular conversion experience. You can't simply start believing, or have always believed and join the church, and there you go. There has to be that moment. I can tell you from experience that this means that kids raised in this kind of religion end up having anxiety over whether or not they're saved, because they rarely have a conversion moment, since they were raised as part of the religion.
And for me, pastor said, to receive Jesus as your Lord and Savior. And our little liberal church said, like to talk about Jesus as our Savior. But when he said, will you submit to Jesus for the rest of your life? My inner brain just exploded.
Could he talk any slower?
Took me about 1 second, and I said yes.
Wow, look at that. My prediction was right. At this point, it's basically a tale as old as time. Some person with a decent education converts to a version of Christianity for which basic reality and science are uncomfortable for emotional reasons. Then later they decide that their emotional needs are at odds with reality, so they decide that it's reality that's wrong, and they're going to go become a reality-denying creationist to deal with that cognitive dissonance. The much rarer, to the point I'm not sure it's ever happened, version would be someone who realized for scientific reasons that the universe is only 6,000 years old, and or that evolution is actually fake, and only then do they realize that there's been a religion saying that the whole time.
And when I came out of the water, I was radically changed.
Heightened emotional experiences will do that, but you'll note that being dunked underwater in a religious ceremony isn't actually evidence for a young Earth, or that evolution is fake, or that Adam and Eve were real persons who lived 6,000 years ago.
It's just amazing. And so my wife and I have been growing ever since. But the first 10 years after baptism, I was embracing things of church, the things of God. But I didn't know what to do with evolution because I had been an evolutionist all my life.
And yeah, now we know my prediction was completely accurate. So let's remember, this whole thing was that there was never an evidential reason for Sanford to abandon reality and become a nutcase. It was a purely emotional decision. And of course, it couldn't really be otherwise because there is as much evidence supporting young Earth creationism as there is the flat Earth. They're both ludicrous concepts that are only believed for bad reasons.
And I didn't think there was any other possible choice. I'm thinking, well, there must be some way to fit evolution into this story.
And he could have done it very simply by recognizing that the histories of Genesis 1 through 11 are not actual records of real events, and cannot be since they aren't even a single coherent narrative, but numerous contradictory narratives cobbled together. Genesis 1 and 2 are separate creation stories that disagree on the basic order of creation. In one part of Genesis, Cain and Abel are the only other humans other than their parents. Later, though, Cain has the possibility of running into fully populated cities and also just randomly manage to get a wife, indicating that the world is in fact full of people. If you have a favorite Bible contradiction, put it in the comments. But no, Sanford has to defend both the historicity of the whole Bible, which also requires it to be free of contradictions. And this is where Bible-based nonsense usually starts. With the insistence that the Bible must contain only one history of the world, but that it may not be internally contradictory and that the history really happened. Since that's not even plausible based on just the text of the Bible without reference to external evidence, it should be glaringly obvious that such attempts will contradict science even more strongly.
10 years later, I've talked to many creationists who have have the similar experience. They get saved, and then they don't know what to do with their
Evidence-based beliefs, critical thinking skills, and the capacity for rational thought?
background of evolution is true.
Right, so their evidence-based beliefs, critical thinking, and capacity for rational thought. I think I'm batting 1,000.
And they all do, it's all for all of them, they grow through it, they break through the barrier. Usually it takes a couple of years, and then they go with it.
So it takes about 2 years for someone to finally abandon a concern for evidence when it comes to things like history and science. I had the exact opposite experience. It took me about that long to get rid of creationism once I decided I cared about evidence. I guess it makes sense that it would be a similar in reverse.
Fully surrendering to Christ and to Scripture.
It is impossible to fully surrender to Scripture. Christian scriptures are not internally consistent, and any attempt to figure out a single history of the world or theological framework from them of necessity requires that one ignore or at least downplay parts of the Bible. For example, most creationists have decided that the order of creation and duration of creation in Genesis 1 overrules the different order and duration of creation in Genesis 2. They have decided to ignore basically most of the theology of the Epistle of James in favor of an exaggerated version of the faith-based salvation of Ephesians. They pick and choose which bits of the Torah's law code are important. For example, they find prohibitions against male homosexual acts compelling, but not the fact that the same books also treat an unborn fetus as property and not a person.
Wow.
So that happened to me, and I remember sitting in the living room with a pile of evolution books and a pile of creation books. And I thought they both have really good, sound positions. And
I'm skeptical of this story. I suspect that what actually happened is that he knew that the evolution side had actual good positions, but his dedication to his tradition's view of the Bible made him extremely charitable and credulous about the claims of his co-religionists. I can't prove that that's what happened, but it's at least plausible, since basically any creationist argument I've ever seen has needed little more than an introductory course in the subject it is about in order to thoroughly debunk it.
But these guys are my enemy, and these guys are my brethren.
Yep, I was right again. Who cares about the evidence? He imagined some malice from evolutionary biologists that I can pretty much guarantee they don't actually feel. And on the other hand, there are people who believe like he does, who couldn't possibly have bad motivations. This is just tribalism, and it's one-sided. At least among the evolutionary biologists I know, they don't really care if people are Christian or not, and one of them would actually prefer that people be Christian rather than not. This whole section of the interview is just Sanford admitting that he has no actual good reasons to abandon science, and creationism basically just makes him feel good, so he'll go with it. I doubt, though, that he'd find that acceptable if someone told him that their reason for their testimony that the Book of Mormon is true and that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God was that they felt it to be true in their heart. In that case, I bet he would be able to call that out as a bad reason.
And I thought, well, I guess this isn't such a hard decision. And so again, it was a God moment, and it catapulted me into the creation movement.
I don't know if I could hold up a more clear example of the fact that you have to be intellectually bankrupt to be a young earth creationist who's well-educated.
Well, that is amazing, is it?
What's amazing about a man making a stupid decision for stupid reasons? People have been doing that since people were a thing. That decision by Sanford was stupid, but it was also right in line with both confirmation bias and in-group bias, so it's actually pretty expected. It takes a lot of effort to actually overcome human cognitive biases, and most people fail at least some of the time. The only thing that's exceptional about this is that Sanford definitely knew better, yet he decided that the evidence and reality were secondary to his theology. Essentially, he knows deep down somewhere that he's wrong. In fact, I suspect it might be closer to the surface than one might expect, given that he's also been known to lie about the work of other people, especially Charles Darwin and Moto Kimura, which he probably wouldn't do if he didn't know that he couldn't actually support his claim honestly.
It is hard for some people when you've been brought up with what you think is science, because evolution is presented as, well, this is science. Is that kind of where the crux of how can I let go of, because you're thinking it's science. It feels like I'm letting go of science. Is that kind of where the struggle is?
I don't know if that's where Sanford's struggle was, but it was certainly where mine was, except that I had all my life been presented with creationism as science, and then I took it upon myself to actually look into the topic. I went to see what the rebuttals were from the other side, and to see what their responses were. And in my case, accepting evolution was not in line with either my confirmation or in-group bias. Indeed, after it became well known that I had accepted science in my church, it strained relationships. There were numerous attempts to get me to rejoin the young earth creationist fold, none very successful. Also, interestingly, my rejecting the pseudoscience of creationism in no way changed my religious affiliation. It did change eventually, more than once, but that's not relevant, and it took something like a decade before I left evangelical Protestant Christianity for something else.
Yes, I mean, basically, we are deceived by the world, and we need to break through it.
Pretty rich from the guy who lied about Kimura's fitness distribution by pretending it disregarded beneficial mutations because they were insignificant, instead of the real reason, because positive selection would swamp any neutral evolution signal if they were included. And from the guy who said that sections of The Origin of Species were in German and that the book had no math, both of which are just false. I would love to see what specific lie he's talking about, because, you see, when I say that John Sanford is a liar, I have actual specific things that I can show he said, and show how they're not true, and show good reason as to why John Sanford knows that they're not true. For instance, in order to make such extensive use of Moto Kimura's graphs, Sanford either read his work and knows he's not representing it accurately, or he's citing it without having read it, which is itself just lying about whether he's read it. When it comes to lies about Charles Darwin, again, if he read the book, then he knows that what he's saying isn't true, and since he represents himself as an authority when talking about The Origin of Species, if he has not read it, then he's just lying about having done so. Instead of actually spelling out what the lies are and how he knows, I'll bet he's just going to say that since evolution is the work of Satan, the father of lies, it's just full of lies.
And God helps us, but we need to be part of the formula.
Did he just say, be part of the formula? I honestly have listened to this several times, and I can't really tell what he's saying. Sanford could benefit from some public speaking courses, I think.
And so it is difficult. But as soon as I made that decision, I knew it was the right one.
Of course you would feel that way. It's always comforting to decide that, in fact, your biases were the right biases, and the thing you wanted to be true was true. But reality doesn't actually care what you want to be true, and there is a lot about reality that I don't really like. If you feel good about a belief, then you should probably take that as a reason to go back and really examine that belief. I have found that more often than not, what I want to be true is not what is true. Heck, I still wish young Earth creationism were true. That would answer all sorts of philosophical, historical, and scientific questions that I do not have the answers for, or that I have answers for that I don't like. Sure, it would also entail some things that I do not like, but whatever.
And the first thing I thought of was, well, what can I do? And then I thought, well, maybe I could do something with genetics.
Which brings us to where we are now, with Sanford being one of the better educated and hence less honest creationists out there.
And so I started to think about that. And actually, it was really interesting because I started to rethink the evolutionary heroes of the day.
That's such a weird thing to me. Science doesn't really have heroes. It has pioneers, sure, people who were the first to come up with what would later be important scientific concepts. But what matters is not the persons who do the science, but ultimately the evidence. If it turned out that Newton, Galileo, and Darwin were absolutely awful, horrible, no good, very bad people, that wouldn't actually matter to science. Indeed, in some ways, Galileo was in fact a dick. Yet, that's not really a problem for our model of the solar system.
And what I saw was that a lot of the founders of neo-Darwinian theory were really hotshot intellectuals.
Oh fun, a dose of anti-intellectualism. Nothing says I am very smart like deciding that people who know what they're talking about as a result of years of study and demonstrable expertise are in fact wrong because of that very study and expertise. No wonder creationist organizations are having problems with their fans turning out to be anti-vaxxers and flat earthers. They learned how to deny reality and expert advice from the creationists themselves.
But they actually all expressed uncertainty that they could fully explain what's happening.
In other words, they were all scientists who were appropriately cautious about their conclusions and didn't leap to unfounded levels of confidence like they had the backing of God. Oh, wait. Yeah. That's exactly the problem. They weren't pretending that they were speaking for the Almighty, when creationists do pretend that.
One of the things that I learned was that one of the most famous ones, Mueller, said if human beings have more than one mutation per person per generation, evolution cannot work. We are all on our way down.
Except that he did not say that, not even a little. Muller is most famous for a similar idea called Muller's ratchet, which says that in a population in which there is no genetic recombination, that is, a haploid asexually reproducing population, there are no ways to isolate beneficial mutations from deleterious ones, and since on average far more mutations will be deleterious than beneficial, such populations must tend towards lower fitness, and therefore declining population size, since, definitionally, lower fitness means less population. You might notice that humans are neither haploid nor asexual in terms of reproductive strategy, even if some humans are asexual in terms of personal behavioral preference. Humans reproduce sexually, and this allows for recombination, which means that beneficial mutations can accumulate in a genome with deleterious mutations being eliminated by selection. Even microbes, the context in which Muller was actually working, undergo forms of mutation and sexual reproduction on occasion, which allows for them to accumulate beneficial mutations while removing deleterious mutations from the genetic background containing the beneficial mutations. Now, that does also mean that many single-celled haploid organisms simply will not reproduce due to the effects of Muller's ratchet. And that is just true. Trillions of bacteria and other single-celled organisms die all the time while failing to reproduce. Muller's ratchet has never applied to organisms like humans, and I find it hard to believe that Sanford does not know this.
From one mutation, because one mutation adds to another, adds every generation you have more and more mutations. He said that would be deadly.
Yes, but only because the populations he was describing had no option to remove those mutations short of the death of the whole organism. Humans are not in that situation. It is a simple fact that virtually every human on Earth is heterozygous for numerous horrific genetic diseases that are each rare on their own, but collectively common enough that virtually all individuals are assured to have at least some such alleles. Because they are recessive, this normally does not cause a problem, but it is also possible for a human to simply not pass that allele on to one of their offspring. For example, suppose that you were heterozygous for an allele on chromosome 3 that, if expressed, would cause death at a young age. Let us also suppose that on the same chromosome you have an allele that is beneficial, perhaps protecting you from some degree of cancer or heart disease. You may expect that any of your offspring must inherit both or neither of those alleles, but this is wrong. During meiosis, the process that results in gametes or sex cells, that is, eggs and sperm, chromosomes will undergo crossover, such that the resulting chromosome 3 in the gametes will actually be a mix of both of your chromosome 3s. This means that some of your gametes' chromosome 3 will have only the deleterious allele, and some only the beneficial one, and some will have both or neither. Further, because your offspring will also inherit chromosomes from your reproductive partner, your grandchildren can inherit beneficial alleles from both you and your partner on the same chromosome, since your children's chromosomes will also undergo crossover during gametogenesis. Now, of course, just like the mutations that produce all these alleles, this crossover is stochastic, and there is as much chance that one of your grandchildren will suffer from an accumulation of deleterious alleles, but that is where selection comes in. In that case, the grandchildren with an overaccumulation of deleterious alleles will reproduce less, meaning that evolution can segregate beneficial alleles even when they arise on the same chromosome as deleterious alleles, and also promote the propagation of such beneficial alleles without in the long term propagating the deleterious alleles originally linked to them. In this way, deleterious mutations are not additive in the long run in sexually reproducing populations like humans. Further, Sanford's claim that each mutation is going to be deleterious ignores that most mutations are in fact neutral, and so even if they did have purely additive effects that persisted through time, they would not be as dangerous as he indicates. Further, it is not the case that all variations have an additive effect. Some mutations can be deleterious except in the presence of yet another mutation, which on its own may even be deleterious, yet taken together can be advantageous. Basically, Sanford is wrong at every step.
And so, and then many high-level scientists.
Okay, so remember, we're talking levels 16 through 20 scientists here. Level 12 scientists can get out of here. We don't need them.
Who built the Darwinian idea, not the idea, but really the science, what they considered the science.
Okay, so I guess just Darwin then? Because let's remember, everything like genetics, mutation, niche construction, drift, etc., that's all post-Darwin, and it's not Darwinian. Darwin was not the end of evolutionary biology. He was basically the very beginning. We've come a long way since Darwin, and Darwin himself would probably barely recognize modern evolutionary biology.
All had places in their life where it didn't make sense, or where they were just simply in error.
Yeah, they're scientists, not gods. Humans aren't perfect and they make mistakes. Scientists aren't immune to this.
Fisher was a really famous, he was the first one to create what was called the neo-Darwinian synthesis. Really brought science to it. Darwin didn't bring science, he brought philosophy to it.
Yeah, except for all those experiments and expeditions to gather data. Let's just ignore those things.
So like 50 years later, Fisher brought what he thought was the science.
The funny thing is that the primary thing added to evolutionary biology when the neo-Darwinian synthesis was being formed was genetics. And so by Sanford dismissing the additions to Darwinian evolution as what he thought was the science, he's essentially implying that genetics isn't science. Of course, Sanford is himself a trained geneticist, so I guess Sanford is saying that he's not a scientist since genetics isn't science. It's almost like he didn't think this one through.
And one of my colleagues, not so many years ago, and I looked at his work and discovered that it had a huge flaw, huge flaw. And when we corrected it, it meant that Fisher said the theorem that he presented was ensured that everything would always keep evolving upward. And when we corrected his mathematical error, everything goes down.
First, I just have to say that Eric grinning like an idiot creeped me out something fierce. Second, Sanford is alluding to his 2018 paper, The Fundamental Theorem of Natural Selection with Mutations, which he co-authored with William F. Basner. Rather amusingly, the paper claims to have overturned an obscure theorem in evolutionary biology by adding a term for mutation to the derivation of the theorem. Of course, the reason that's rather amusing is that there was always a term for mutation in the theorem. It's a barred lowercase delta, which means that they never actually understood the theorem in the first place. They then pretended that their work showed that fitness in any population should always decline. The problem with this, though, is that it does not match reality. So even if they were right that the original math was incomplete, their conclusion cannot be right, because reality doesn't agree. And in science, whenever anything, whether it be Sanford's math or the text of the Bible, disagrees with reality, the thing is wrong and should be dismissed. Further, a full refutation of the paper was written by friends of the channel Zach B. Hancock and Dan Stern-Cardinal, which show that even with Sanford and Basner's absurd assumptions like fixed fitness effects, etc., they can still get sustained fitness increases in populations, even with mean positive fitness effects as low as 0.001, and with a population cap of only 1,000, and with a beneficial mutation rate as low as 1%. This means that while being absurdly generous to the creationist position, they still saw sustained fitness increase in simulated populations, something Sanford insists is impossible. So math, theory, and reality all say Sanford is just dead wrong about all of this. One group of people who are not dead wrong about all of this are my supporters. If you're enjoying the video, please be sure to hit like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Additionally, if you want to support the channel financially, there are some great ways to do so, like Patreon linked in the description, which starts at only $1 a month, and you can get a 15% discount for paying annually. The memberships can be joined with the join button below this video, that starts at $1.99 a month, and both give you access to my super secret Discord server, and early access to my scripted videos. There are higher tiers for more perks.
Wow.
We completely reversed Fisher.
Yes, if the paper is taken at face value. But of course, if you actually look into it, all they did was play with numbers in inappropriate ways based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Fisher's theorem. And even then, their math doesn't actually work out or match reality, so oops.
And he's probably one of the most famous scientists ever.
This is entirely unimportant, but that's just a really weird thing to say. Compared to Gregor Mendel, Charles Darwin, Galileo Galilei, Albert Einstein, all of whom are household names, Fisher is barely known outside of evolutionary biology. And even then, most evolutionary biologists have never heard of his theorem, because all it does is show that under certain conditions, fitness will increase, which isn't exactly controversial. Nor was that ever really contested in evolutionary biology. The only reason Sanford cares about it is because, as the guy who invented so-called genetic entropy, he cares very much that fitness decrease under essentially all conditions, which we know experimentally to be false. But he figured if he could play funny games with math and submit a paper about that to a journal that doesn't really have a lot of population geneticists to ask for peer review, then he could backdoor genetic entropy into the peer-reviewed literature, thereby making him seem like a serious scientist, even though he gave that up decades ago. To put it mildly, he wasn't really successful, and while Fisher's fundamental theorem is scarcely known by evolutionary biologists, Even among those who do know about it, virtually none of them have ever heard of Sanford and Basner's paper, let alone read it. It made absolutely no effect on evolutionary biology, and is only used as a feather in Sanford's cap so that he can say he is very smart.
And for decades, people worshipped him, but never actually understood what he was saying.
I'm going to need a citation for that one. But also, it is actually true that Fisher's work was widely misunderstood because he wasn't the clearest writer.
And he was ignoring his own, he glossed over something that was essential.
That sounds juicy.
And so just a few years ago, we published that paper, and it was widely read. Maybe 30,000 scientists looked at it.
Yeah, I'm going to need a citation on that, because I have never heard of anyone who isn't deeply involved in the creation-evolution discussion, even being aware that Sanford's published paper exists. And let's be clear, virtually no scientists are even aware that creationists are still a thing. Just like basically no one in the aerospace industry is really aware that flat earthers exist. Also, what did Fisher ignore?
So it's been a really interesting journey.
I guess we just don't get to know. Cool.
No doubt. By the way, you guys have to check out that paper and his other works. Dr. Sanford's works are available.
Eric takes too long just to say that you can go to logosresearchassociates.org to find the paper. I've also linked to it in the description. I would encourage you to also check out the rebuttal by Hancock and Sir Cardinal, which is also linked.
Since you're a geneticist, I got to ask you this. When it comes to the origin of life, it seems to me like there's either the divine creation account.
I find it amusing that he pretends that there is only one divine creation account when there are in fact two just in Genesis, and there are others from across the world.
There's the lightning striking the primordial soup idea that used to be taught.
A gross simplification, but okay.
And then more recently, there's the panspermia, or aliens seeded life on planet Earth, and so life just came from somewhere else, so we pushed the problem further away. I don't know if there's any others, but
there are as many as you can imagine, which is why there are so many different divine accounts. Because the thing that they all have in common is just that. They were imagined by people who didn't know the first thing about biology, except that if you stop breathing or lost too much blood, you die. That's why God in one account commands the waters and land to bring forth living things, but in another, he breathes life directly into Adam. And in one Egyptian account, a god drops semen onto the ground, bringing forth life. Or in an Indian account, life is essentially the dream of a god. You can just keep making up creation myths. Science, though, is concerned with this little pesky thing called evidence. There is no evidence for panspermia, and there is no evidence for any divine origin of life. We do, however, have some evidence for chemical systems and pathways that might get us to life, and hence, that's where all the origin of life research is.
As a geneticist, how do you see the options when it comes to the origin of life on Earth?
Well, given that he's a former geneticist who abandoned caring about reality or evidence for emotional reasons, I'll bet he'll choose the option that makes him feel the most warm and fuzzy feelings. Which I bet is that it's a direct miracle by God who loves him for his abandonment of reality, and given that he's a Christian, I'll bet he'll go with something that looks a whole lot like the creation account in Genesis 1, but that ignores that it contradicts the account in Genesis 2.
So if people had, more and more people actually understand that life is unbelievably intricate.
Or maybe he'll just start waffling on. Odd choice, but hey, it's his choice to make.
It's information systems on top of information systems on top of information systems.
Ah yes, information, a word that is right up there with kind in terms of words creationists love to use, but hate to define in any useful way.
It's like an operating system, but as Bill Gates says...
I don't give a f*** what Bill Gates says about genetics. He's even less qualified than Sanford on the topics, and no, genetics is not like an operating system. That's why geneticists don't learn how to make operating systems, and why software developers don't study genetics to write operating systems.
It's just totally clear that life cannot arise spontaneously.
Pro tip to creationists out there. An argument from incredulity combined with a random quote from someone who has no training in the field isn't really a good argument. There's no reason complexity on its own is a barrier to evolution or abiogenesis, and even if current life is too complex to form spontaneously, current life is not what the first life was, so that still wouldn't matter.
And to get life, kickstart life, you need so many miracles to happen all at the same time, same place, same moment.
Weird how no origins of life researchers seem to agree, and I now wonder if he will give any examples of such miracles, because if he doesn't, then he actually hasn't made an argument, just an assertion.
And so it's laughable, except people keep sweeping it under the rug. There are more and more actually evolutionists who are acknowledging this could only be by design. I can't see how this could arise just by trial and error.
Such as whom? The only biologists I see doing this are the creationists, and they're a dwindling lot who have yet to make a single contribution to science on the basis of their creationist ideas. Although, admittedly, some have made contributions unrelated to creationism, Sanford being one of them. Creationists love this idea that scientists are abandoning science to join them in delusion, but they're always vague on who is doing it, or what the numbers are. It's like flat earthers who declare that people are waking up and becoming flurfs in big numbers, all while interest in their insanity declines as they're continuously and very publicly humiliated. Just as an example, creationists tried to get a huge list of so-called evolution skeptics by asking numerous people to sign an ambiguously worded statement, many of whom weren't even scientists in relevant fields, and then promoted the list as a list of scientists rejecting evolution, which it never was. Then, when many of the signatories got wind of the scheme, they asked for their names to be removed, only for their names to remain. Meanwhile, Project Steve, a similar project asking only scientists in relevant fields and only those named Steve or something etymologically related, such as Stephanie, to sign, quickly has amassed far more signatures. Of course, all of this ignores that if Sanford weren't lying about this, it would just be an argumentum ad populum, and one based on a minority anyway.
Had to be divinely created, which is exactly what this says. I love it. A scientist's opinion, you got it right there, guys. Go no further.
First, I did not cut off the first part of Eric's sentence. He just started with the predicate and no subject. Second, that's not the opinion of a scientist, and even when he was a scientist, it wasn't in the field of origin of life, meaning that his opinion, even if he were still a scientist, would be pretty useless. It would be like asking an HVAC company to fix your car on the grounds that they're mechanics.
Do genetics. You wrote the book Genetic Entropy, showing that we are going downhill.
No, he wrote the book Genetic Entropy, claiming that humans are going downhill. But the first hint that that's not what he did is just how the book was published. It was published by Back to Genesis, not, a scientific publishing house. That means it was not intended to be read by anyone who knows what they're talking about when it comes to genetics. Further, the actual text is also obviously not intended for anyone who actually knows about genetics. Of course, even worse, the idea of genetic entropy does not work mathematically, as was shown in the actually peer-reviewed paper by Hancock and Stern-Cardinal, already referenced. Because it's mathematically incoherent, but also it simply does not match observation. Both in the lab and in the wild, we have seen sustained fitness gains in populations contra the predictions of genetic entropy. Genetic entropy is not an attempt at science. It's an attempt at apologetics, that is, an attempt to keep those who already believe Sanford's anti-science version of Christianity in the fold. Of course, his version of Christianity is not the only one, and many forms of Christianity do not require the denial of basic facts about reality, like common ancestry and descent with modification. Above is a link to the literature review by both Hancock and Stern-Cardinal, in case you'd rather watch that than read their paper.
But if you actually go backwards, I want to know, does this really show us a divine origin account with Adam and Eve? Can we see that in every single one of our cells? Is that what this is pointing us to?
No. It's a flat no. Nothing in genetics supports the existence of a single pair of humans who made it together to produce all future humans, and especially not so recently as 6,000 years ago.
Can you take us on that journey?
Yes, and actually we're going to talk about that.
We're like 10 minutes into this talk, John. The time to say what you will say has passed. Just say what your claims and arguments are.
So we're talking about layer and layer of information. There's also layer upon layer of evidence, and that's really exciting.
There are multiple layers of evidence, from genetics to morphology to the fossil record, all pointing towards one conclusion. Humans are apes who evolved from a common ancestor with the members of genus Pan some 6 or 7 million years ago.
And so what we learn is that the Bible is, in fact, a reliable historical resource and has science in it.
You serious?
Oh, how surprising. John thinks the evidence supports the position he got to without evidence in the first place. Fun.
In fact, we're going to show that the that patriarchs were living to be, in the 900s.
First, let's get to the point of the evidence for Adam and Eve. Second, I'm not aware of any work by Sanford on the great age of the biblical patriarchs, but hey, I haven't read everything he's ever written.
Which makes perfect sense if you realize that this was shortly after the fall and mutations had not yet been accumulated.
Oh, so it's just genetic entropy. Right.
And so those first patriarchs were, it seems ridiculous until we realize what we're saying. Of course, they were 100 years old. If they hadn't been a fall, they'd still be alive today.
Here's the reason that actually sounds ridiculous. First, since genetic entropy is mathematically impossible, there's no particular reason to talk about it as the cause of the incredible lifespans of the biblical patriarchs. Second, what possible changes to the genetics of humans could allow people, especially people living before basic things like medical science or even soap, to live so long? Just hand-waving at genetics being bad now but good in the past doesn't really answer the question. What specific parts of the genome have degraded in what way that have shortened human lifespans? If there's no answer to this, then genetic entropy, even if it weren't mathematically impossible, isn't an explanation. It's like blaming a plane crash on the wind. Unless you can say how the wind actually caused the plane crash, then just saying the wind doesn't actually explain anything. Especially if your version of how wind works has been experimentally and mathematically invalidated.
So that's, we're going to see that.
Pro tip, you're allowed to finish sentences.
Not only does that curve show that the patriarchs underwent what's called a biological decay curve, where everything is sloping downward in a curve, moving toward extinction.
What curve? Has Eric's editor failed to show a graphic that Creation Today was provided or something? I don't think this one is on Sanford. I think it's on Hovind and his team. I suspect there is a curve we're just not seeing because they forgot to put it on screen.
Not only is that true, but we can, like you said, look backwards. Because if mutations are accumulating and you look backwards, there had to be some point where there were no mutations.
Nope, unless we're talking about the very first life form with a genetic code. You see, if we trace all human genetic variation back to its coalescent point, the point where humans have a single ancestral genetic code for that region of the genome, we find that different regions of the genome actually have different coalescence times. Which means that as far back as we can go, there was always variation in the human genome. And even if we go back to the longest ago coalescent ancestor for any part of the human genome, something which, as far as I know, has not been identified, but which must logically exist, there is no reason that that genome is particularly special, and it also exists in a population with genetic diversity, which we can tell because we can also extend coalescence outside of just Homo sapiens, something which on its own tosses special creation off the boat and into the waters of stupid bullshit that opposes reality. Until we get to the very first genetic code ever, all genetic diversity is caused by mutations, so you cannot meaningfully say that organisms in the past had fewer mutations. They were all mutations. Now, a special creation believer might counter that the first genetic codes were actually specially created by God and had no mutations, since they did not have ancestral genomes from which to mutate. And that's all well and good, except that, at least for young Earth creationists, we can't find a coalescence time that fits within their timeline for the Earth's existence. And to be fair to them, since they expect that kinds were created with adult members with no ancestry, we should prefer the time to the most recent 4 alleles, a concept pioneered by theistic evolutionist and Christian biologist Joshua Swamidass. Of course, the problem is that when he ran the numbers on this, it still violates the young Earth timeline, and also failed to support a human population bottleneck of 2 at any point in the past. Okay, let's move on because I feel like I'm rambling.
And that's what takes us right back to Adam and Eve.
Mathematically impossible and incredibly stupid genetics from a man who uses emotions rather than evidence to judge the truth of propositions is what takes us back to Adam and Eve? I mean, yeah, that checks out. It's not like it was going to be science, since there never were 2 original unspoiled perfect humans. Also, you might be aware that creationists and intelligent design proponents, and even C-design proponentsists, are all supporting the charge of the far right and even ethno-nationalism. Do you think it's a coincidence that Sanford believes in an original genetically pure human genome that has been lost to corruption? Sure sounds a lot like racial purity ideology, and while I don't think that's an idea that Sanford would accept, he sure isn't doing anything to hinder that idea, and his work could easily be used to support it.
No mutations until the fall.
That implies that there were perfect mechanisms of DNA replication and repair. But that raises a question. The reason organisms don't have perfect mechanisms for DNA repair is not primarily because it's impossible. It's not clear that it is impossible. But rather, it's that it's costly. We can see this fact demonstrated by the existence of mutational hotspots. Perhaps the most famous example of such hotspots was found in Arabidopsis thaliana, a small plant native to Eurasia and North Africa, but that has been introduced to much of the rest of the world, including most of North America, parts of South America, East Africa, and Australia. Some parts of its genome have much higher rates of mutation than other parts. While obviously it is more complicated than this, in general, those parts of the genome that are involved in vital and very sequence-dependent functions tend to have slower mutation rates, and those that are not functional have higher mutation rates. This protects the organism from an abundance of harmful mutations. But why not have the low mutation rates across the whole genome? Well, because error correction mechanisms are metabolically costly, and if you don't need them, then the organism is better off not bothering with them. So did Adam and Eve just spend way more energy on cell division? Did they not need cell division before the fall? If so, does that mean that Eve didn't menstruate, and that Adam and Eve couldn't grow hair or fingernails, or repair damage to their skin? Does that apply to all organisms? Saying there were no mutations before the fall sounds great, but when you actually dig into what that would really mean, you quickly realize it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
I begin this with this title, Good Science Affirms Scripture.
Now, let's remember what he actually means by that title. He does not mean that when you do good science, you find that the Bible is true. Rather, he means by that you can judge science as being good or bad based on whether it confirms your particular interpretation of the Bible. I'm sure Sanford himself would think those two different meanings are essentially the same, but they're not.
And for the last 20-some years that I've been a creationist scientist.
Okay, I'm going to choose my words very carefully. It is not impossible to be a creationist who is also an actual scientist. Similarly, it is not impossible to think that the Earth is flat or that vaccines cause autism and be a scientist. But in all three cases, it's going to be very tough to do. Virtually every field of science contradicts young Earth creationism in some way, just like it does flat Earth, although I suppose this is less the case for vaccine denialism. On the other hand, as near as I can tell, Sanford has never been a creationist and a scientist at the same time. He certainly is not one now.
I've discovered, and my colleagues like Rob Carter and so many other scientists.
Rob Carter is also not a scientist. He is a pseudoscientist. They are not the same thing. Rob Carter is a scientist the way Benedict Cumberbatch is a detective or a sorcerer.
Is that we believe this is true. Good science affirms Scripture.
I'm sure that they do believe that, and it is evidence that they are not scientists. Not a result of them being scientists. But again, this is not a statement that science, when done well, supports the Bible, since it generally does not, but it is instead a claim that the only things they are willing to count as good science is that which affirms the Bible, which ironically enough often corresponds to science that is done poorly, sometimes fraudulently, and which often ignores most of the relevant data.
It makes a great title for a book, and in the meantime, I encourage everyone to think along these lines. There is bad science that promotes evolution, but
Ah yes, the science that all the scientists do is mean poopy head science. That's how we get to conclusions that make Sanford feel bad, like universal common ancestry, the reality and cause of climate change, and that his mommy was wrong to love him.
the good science continuously affirms Scripture. So Adam and Eve have been, trashed for hundreds of years, not thousands of years, but a few hundred years.
Have they? Their existence, being obviously not literally true, has been denied by basically everyone who cares about evidence or reality for that long, but that's not the same thing as trashing them. Just saying that someone didn't exist isn't trashing them. I don't sit around trashing Captain James T. Kirk or James R. Kirk, because they're fictional. Similarly, I don't think I've ever really trashed Adam or Eve. I'm not sure what the point would be. I suppose I am now trashing someone who thinks they were real historical characters, despite the fact that he knows better. But that's because he's an intellectually dishonest idiot who's playing backup for people who would see my friend's existence made illegal, and who would remove what few effective public health measures the United States has.
And now science, good science, is restoring Adam and Eve.
And I'm beginning to think we won't even get to any of that science in this episode. Oh well, I suppose that's why I'll make another one, perhaps even one after that.
Okay, so this work was in close connection with Dr. Robert Carter, who's an awesome geneticist in his own right.
Not how I'd describe him.
So I give him most of the credit. I'm more of a cheerleader than a lab scientist.
Hey, props to Sanford for having a modicum of self-awareness. That's more than I can say for most creationists.
So he has worked with me with my little foundation, Feed My Sheep Foundation.
Yes, a name that just screams scientific rigor.
And so he contributed to this PowerPoint, this work, and also Dr. Wes Brewer, who's a world expert in numerical simulation, which is a way of analyzing complex things. Dr. John Baumgartner, which is...
I know Baumgartner primarily for his simulations of catastrophic plate tectonics that required him to increase the thermal diffusivity of the Earth's crust by a factor of about 1,000.
One of the top creation scientists in the world.
I feel like if you just decide that reality is inconvenient by like 3 orders of magnitude, that makes you a top scientist in creation land. No wonder no one in any scientific field takes them seriously, and their ideas just fail to gain traction. They're wrong before they even analyze them.
Dr. Franzine Smith, who has helped me for years on our work, and others. So I really believe in teams, and we had a great team for this particular line of research.
Wow, 15 minutes in, and we still haven't actually gotten to the point. But at least it gave me an excuse to talk about why creationism isn't science, and why creationists generally are not scientists. I guess we'll go into John's super big-brained arguments next time. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content, if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Hovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elleron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.